Thanks for coming. I'm Alan Blum, and I'm a professor and chair of family medicine. And that's Josh Foster. He's with IT, and you know Jeremy Cole, but there's a lot of work that goes into these talks, especially Jeremy every week. So I just want you to know how much I appreciate what he does, and it's a good turnout, so thank you. Why am I so excited? Because I get to do this talk about every other year or so. And I've been speaking on polio since the 90s when I did a grand rounds with an individual named Dr. Carlos Valbona, who was one of the leading experts on post-polio syndrome. And it's always had an interest for me, and I'll tell you why. Part of this is somewhat autobiographical. We're going to review some of the history, and really, why is this so important now? Even though I've probably done talks on polio about 20 times, it seems that this is why we really need to learn about this right now. And it's, in New York State, it's called an emergency. The first case of polio in over a decade was discovered in New York, upstate New York, in July. It was officially announced in September, and a polio emergency was declared. I mean, you know, it's not easy to take a disease that none of us have actually seen firsthand and suddenly learn about it. But remember, COVID was just a couple of years ago. We hadn't seen that either. And so I think it's an important topic to address, and I think there's some good take-home points, and let's hope you don't see a case of polio. But our state is already recommending that we step up our vaccination questions and that we really do things that we thought we'd already been doing. I had a patient when I was a resident in the late 70s at the University of Miami, and she had polio as a child, and she'd had some disability that lasted. But she wasn't happy with the doctor that she had, and she told me, that doctor I had didn't know anything about polio. Said it just weren't her generation to know nothing about it. Well, now, 2 generations have passed since my residency that weren't expected to know anything about polio. So my goal today is to get you to know something about it and to realize and appreciate that even though hopefully we may see very few cases, that each case is extremely important. So it was found, first, you know, I heard this in June, actually, out of London, that they identified poliovirus in the sewage. Apparently that's how they keep track of things, as well as COVID. They're looking at the waste. And it was there. It's probably always there, but this was in higher quantities. Most of us have probably had polio going through us, perfectly asymptomatic, but they began to worry because of the increased amount they were seeing. And this is true in London and also in Israel. And that led them to realize this has not just been new, it's probably been circulating for as long as a year. And the health department in New York State rapidly responded by saying, we've got to get vaccinated, because the case that was found in Rockland County in upstate New York was a young man who hadn't traveled, was there, but the problem with the there is that he lived in a very insular community of Orthodox Jewish individuals whose vaccination rate was 60%. The rest of New York State, 79%. You've got to have around an 80% vaccination rate to have what we would call herd immunity. So parents who hadn't heard about polio in years and years were hearing about it in the news. The doctor said, be calm, just double check your vaccination. And we know what our vaccination schedule is here. Do we want to repeat it? It's 2-4 months, and then again anywhere between around 12 to 15 months. So it's 3 IPV, which is the Salk vaccine now, and we'll go over the history of the vaccinations. So here you have, in our time, less than a month ago, a polio emergency declared. And every single case is a case for alarm. Because it's not just the contagion factor, it's the level of taking it for granted and saying, oh, one case isn't really serious. And here we are, this just appeared a couple weeks ago. We are urging one another to be aware of it and to make sure the polio vaccinations are up to date. Why? How? We're going to go into that today. And it's pretty scary. So I've had a patient for some time, and he came in a year or so ago And I did a little dirty trick on the resident. I said, would you mind, I'm really busy, would you mind just going in? And I heard he has a scab on just below his knee, and he probably just needs a little irrigation and, some polysporin on it, and he's probably fine. And the resident came back, said, oh yeah, that's pretty much all it was, it was just, otherwise everything was normal. I said, really, did you notice anything else about the patient? No. I said, okay, well, let's go and see it. And I asked if he would, the first thing the patient would do would just raise the other pant leg. And this was a patient that I have who had polio as a child. He sustained, he was in an iron lung. You'll see those in a minute. He pretty much lost the musculature of his right leg. And really there's not just the withered leg there that's important to notice, but it's the other leg that he might have noticed had he thought about. That's a pretty thick calf, and that's a hypertrophied lower extremity. So it's not just the withered leg, it's not just the loss of full function there, it's what the other leg had to do to take up for what happened when he was a child and he developed paralytic polio. And this, I always dedicate the talks that I give on polio to Holly Williams. She was our appointment clerk and sometime manager of our clinic at Baylor, and Jill of all trades, and fellow Astros fan. They just swept the Mariners, but we would go to games, and you could see that she had also what we call a withered leg, and she had polio as a 5-year-old, and she was in the Shriners Hospital, and she had a great sense of humor. She said one day they came around with polio vaccines, and she says, hey guys, I already have it. When that's a 5-year-old, that's her sense of humor that she always had. Holly passed away, but she was a fantastic influence on all of us in the clinic at Baylor. But polio doesn't, it's not just a modern disease that we worry about. It goes back upwards of, we can identify it upwards of 3,000 years ago. This is a stone from Egypt about 1500 BC, where you can see the pharaoh or the young man with 3 things. A walking stick there to prop him up, a withered leg, and a foot drop. All signs of paralytic polio. So we've known about those descriptions, and a physician in England described more specifically the nature of the paralysis in the late 1700s. And it wasn't known to be a virus until 1908. And then again, it wasn't really photographed as an electron microscopic image until the 1930s. And I handed out, Jeremy was kind of disseminate the articles, or the main article is the first chapter in Michael Bliss's The Making of Modern Medicine. And, is there any comment, just for 1 to 2 minute discussion, any comment you might have on that chapter? Anything at all? Top of the head? Should I survey who read it? But no, it's really worth reading if you hadn't had a chance to. What's your take home point from that chapter? You got to call on somebody. We had some good comments 2 years ago when we said, anything at all? Did you want to? What do you think he was trying to get across in that chapter? Okay. Anybody read it? No? Okay. Good, we'll mark that down. Everybody fails, all right. But basically, I really hope you read that chapter, because it was pretty amazing to see what happened in Montreal in the 1880s. So William Osler, before he became a knight, was a physician trained in Canada who was still in Montreal in the 1870s when he had a case of smallpox. And how do you think he approached this case of smallpox? What was his method of treatment? What is the treatment for smallpox? There is none. So what did William Osler do? At the patient's request, too. He sat and read him verses from the Bible. And that's not to make fun of anybody's therapy. Osler's father was a minister. So reading the Bible was, a very comforting way to get people through an illness. But that's the medical armamentarium that we had in the 1870s. By 1884 or 1885, when an outbreak started with one rare conductor having the disease, and this then spreading and becoming rapidly in Montreal, there were a few factors that caused it to spread. The main factor was the French-Canadian, poor French-Canadian community had been advised by their priests to avoid vaccination. And this is even though the Catholic Church had fully endorsed vaccinations by the 1850s all over the world. This group in French Canada did not believe in that. And then there were a couple of Ontario physicians who were very against vaccination of any kind. When did vaccinations begin? How long have we had vaccination? Surely we know that. Who was credited with modern vaccination? Jenner, when did Jenner do that? 1790s, right. But actually it goes back well before that. It's believed that some civilizations, going back 1,000 years, had identified, and it had been a tradition among Scottish farmers and milkmaids who had come down with cowpox from milking cows to inoculate others with cowpox. So there was even an outbreak in Boston in the 1720s that was stopped by the immunizations that, this is 70 years before Jenner, that the American doctors had heard of that the milkmaids were doing. And we probably wouldn't be sitting here in the United States of America if it weren't for vaccination against smallpox. What am I referring to? Who did a mass vaccination that saved the United States of America? The hint is it's before Jenner. Well, it's good history to learn that George Washington inoculated his troops against smallpox. That's 20 years before, this is 1776, 20 years before Jenner did this on a more systematic fashion in the 1790s in Scotland. And there were other outbreaks of polio recognized in Stockholm, Sweden, one of the cleanest cities in the world. And the reason I mention that is because it was believed that sanitation and poor sanitary conditions were responsible for most diseases. The cholera epidemic in London, the Broad Street pump, we finally figured out that it was from the contaminated water, but most physicians of the 1850s in England believed in the miasma theory, that it was foul air that was causing things. In Stockholm, 1887, several hundred cases. In Vermont in 1892, in New York City in 1894, but the big one was in New York City in 1916 when there were over 9,000 cases with 2,343 deaths, mostly in children. But one of the lessons for today is that in the period of time between 1949 and 54, when this was looked at specifically, adults comprised upwards of 35% of the cases. We think of the influenza epidemic of 1918 as the last great epidemic before the current epidemic of COVID. And there are things that relate to them, that relate both of these. Jonas Salk, for instance, learned from that epidemic. And we learned a lot, the military learned a lot, because the military lost almost as many soldiers in World War I, 44,000, as they did from military combat, over 50,000. So the influenza pandemic was something that we were not forgetting when World War II came around. And Jonas Salk was one of the individuals who was enlisted to work on vaccinations, and he helped to develop flu vaccinations in the military that saved countless lives. So what is a polio virus, and what are viruses in general? They're called living chemicals, where you have oxygen, hydrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, carbon, and a couple of other things in a kind of crystalline format. The makeup of the polio virus is very simple. It's just a protein envelope or capsid and core RNA. And it's like a crystalline structure, but it can't exist on its own. It has to take over the cell's function to reproduce. And this is a schematic. These on the diagonals on the left and the lower right are schematic kind of crystallography images of what the poliovirus looks like. Obviously, the color is for visualizing the capsid, and that's split open on the bottom right to reveal the nest of mRNA. And you can see the first and earliest electron micrographs on the lower left and upper right. An enterovirus. There are three types, two of which have been fairly well put under control. Most of the problems come from type 1. It has entirely a human reservoir. It does not exist in animals. And the methods are both fecal-oral and belatedly recognizing that it was oral, sneezing and coughing. It doesn't survive very long out on its own, so it's got to find a host. And the peak time for communicability is 7 days before the symptoms and 7 days after. And what are the symptoms? Most are mild headache, fever, fatigue, sore throat, stomach ache. The more severe symptoms might take 30 days to arise, which consist of severe headache, severe muscle pains, neck and back stiffness, photophobia, and then the paralysis and maybe even death. What about the contagion value, the so-called RO value? Measles is by far the most contagious virus. I've heard of upwards of 30 for an RO value, but the range is 11 to 30. Polio is right up there. Polio is pretty much the second most contagious virus, right up neck and neck with smallpox. COVID has a relatively lower communicability, as does influenza, but still quite serious.
Is that accounting for Omicron?
I don't know. I don't think that. I'm sure it is. Actually, I got this. That data comes from last year, so it might not. Thank you for asking. So, what is your understanding of Omicron? More or less communicable?
More.
Yeah. But not as serious, though.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's interesting. Good point. So here's an interesting, and I've gone over and over this, and all the times I've been talking about this issue, and it's still hard to get, but it makes sense. So it comes into the mouth, and it used to be believed that it goes to the lymph nodes, it goes to the lymph areas in the back of the throat and multiplies there, but that's not entirely true. It goes right down to the gut, as well as the throat, and it hangs around on the mucosa for a good week or so, and it's a very good environment for it. But then, do you remember Peyer's patches? These lymphoid follicles in the mucosa of the intestine, it affects them. And then it goes regionally into the mesenteric lymph nodes, and then it comes back up to the cervical nodes, the deep cervical nodes, and of course the tonsils. So the tonsils and the Peyer's patches are really where they are most fertile. And then there are so many of them that it gets into the bloodstream, and you have a viremia. And nobody really knows exactly why does it go to the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord, which is where it does its damage. It's simply apparently by chance, because only 1 in 1,000 to maybe even 1 in 10,000 with that viremia will wind up getting paralytic polio. And there's your spinal cord section, which blown up reveals the loss. You can see the paler color of the anterior corner or horns portions of the motor neuron of the spinal cord. And again, most of us are going to be asymptomatic, 72 to 75%. A minor coryza, flu-like symptoms, 24%. But here's the problem of where someone comes in with that horrible headache. You've seen aseptic meningitis. You know they always say it's the worst headache I've ever had, and it's not. There's no specific treatment for it. You usually can get people over it, but it's pretty hard to detect a case of polio in the aseptic meningitis versus any other non-specific viral cause. So that's where I would get most scared these days if I saw someone coming in and we did the LP, which, by the way, the original LP was done in 1891 for hydrocephalus, and then it became adapted by the 1930s as the main way to diagnose polio. The bottom, the flaccid paralysis, those are the dire cases. And, it doesn't sound like there's that many. It's 1 in 1,000 children get paralytic polio. And usually one leg or lower extremity or an upper extremity, but it's the adults. 1 in 1,000 children get it, but 1 in 75 adults get paralytic polio, and they get affected, their chest muscles, which control breathing, with limbs, and with everything else, and that's when you get quadriplegia. So I have met one quadriplegic patient who became a disability rights activist, who got polio as an adult, and it really does, can ruin your life. The scary thing too is that polio can destroy up to 60% of the motor neurons before you feel weakness or paralysis. There are 3 kinds, by the way. So the paralysis is usually asymmetric, usually lower extremities, and a type of polio can cause the respiratory paralysis. And that type is bulbar polio. So you have polio virus is going to attack the cervical spinal cord, the thoracic spinal cord, the lumbar spinal cord, and depending on what motor neurons are distributed, the upper or lower limbs are affected. Bulbospinal means a combination of brain stem and spinal cord. So the bulbar spine is your brainstem, and it's got a white matter trail to the cerebral cortex, and that controls cranial nerves. So you have the glossopharyngeal nerve being affected, and other nerves, and the trigeminal nerve, and you get all sorts of horrible things. This is where if you don't have a glossopharyngeal nerve, you're going to get secretions. You could be arresting because you can't breathe, and so you have to be constantly suctioned. The bulbar is the actual paralysis of the phrenic nerve, of the paralysis of the diaphragm that immediately has to involve resuscitation and getting into what we call an iron lung. So there's a schematic of the muscles that are affected by polio. It's the muscles of movement. The distal areas are not as affected as the proximal areas. And this is, you can get these contractures, you get muscle wasting, but again, nothing that you didn't know from, having heard about polio. And this is your more typical body habitus that affected both lower limbs and the hypertrophied chest. And here's a child in East Asia, another child in Africa.
For most of us, the fear is so far in the past that it is surprising to learn that polio epidemics continue to plague many parts of the world.
So 1916, the babies, that's how we got the name infantile paralysis, the babies were affected. And look at that, 35 dead of paralysis in 48 hours. That is no joke. You can die from this kind of paralysis, especially when you can't breathe, within 2 days. And New York was absolutely itself paralyzed, as you'll see in this particular clip.
Polio was different. Polio is ancient, and people have contracted it for thousands of years all over the world. But it wasn't headline news in America until the summer of 1916.
Every address was published.
First, the symptoms mimicked a cold, with a headache, often a chill, and then sometimes paralysis. The effect might be as mild as a stiff joint or as severe as total paralysis of the arms, the legs, even the whole body. Those whose muscles for breathing or swallowing were hit often died. Doctors had seen this disease before, but never as bad as this. Because it had always seemed to affect only children, the disease was called infantile paralysis. The medical textbooks said poliomyelitis. Like a familiar neighborhood bully, it eventually demanded a nickname: polio. For a decade, better sanitation had steadily driven down many killers like typhoid, dysentery, and tuberculosis. So when alarming numbers of new polio cases came in, public health authorities responded the way they always had. New York City officials doused the streets with 4 million gallons of water a day and killed 72,000 stray cats. Polio cases continued to climb. Health authorities couldn't agree on the right approach, and the public knew it. This fed a growing hysteria about the epidemic.
Well, you know, it was hysteria, and it was legitimate hysteria. I mean, imagine what this did to a young mother. She was quarantined. She still had to change the diapers, somehow earn an income, feed the kids, eat the meals. If she were affected, if she got polio, or if one of her kids got, I mean, it's just astounding the degree to which this was devastating. Who is at risk right now, for instance? The newborns. Although there is passive immunity for a couple of months. Interestingly, in Nigeria, they give vaccination at birth, at 6 weeks, at 10 weeks, and 14 weeks. That's their schedule. And that's the oral vaccine, which is going out of favor. But we didn't have anything back then. And so you have newborns that are at risk. You have children who are up to 2 who have had incomplete schedules of vaccinations. Adults who have either had incomplete vaccination, or such as people who live in certain religious communities that just don't get vaccinated, plus the immunocompromised. And this is, looks like a quaint picture of all these kids who got polio in wheelchairs. I don't think today we can fully appreciate the degree of discrimination and isolation that they felt. First of all, they're removed from their families if they get the diagnosis. That's a minimum of 2 weeks. They got to be out in some polio ward. Then when they're discharged, they usually have to go for rehabilitation and further isolation. And the stigma of a wheelchair. There were no accessibility laws back in the 19-teens. So it was as much an emotional and psychological issue as it was a medical issue. It's not a medical issue with psychological problems. It could be just the opposite. And there was the face of the individual who changed it all. That's Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president, who, when he was 39, before he became president, contracted polio. And that's one of the rare pictures he permitted to be taken of him with his 10 pounds of iron, that he described it. He just did not want to be seen. That was his own personal insecurity. So he discovered a place called Warm Springs, Georgia, where they would have warm baths, and he liked the company of the kids that were around him and the young adults, and so he bought the place. And he would go down there, and this was his retreat. He had the little White House. It's well worth a visit if you get to Georgia. By the 1930s, his close friend and lawyer, Basil O'Connor, was named by Roosevelt to launch an effort to fight, to discover the causes and to fight polio, which was called infantile paralysis. And this became the leading resource for research in the United States. That meant that the government was not funding a whole lot of research. The polio research was the bulk of research in the United States in medicine that was being funded. And it's funny because on the back of it, my mother worked for the March of Dimes, which was the infantile paralysis slogan, and the back of this annual program was a cigarette. But this branched off into the Easter Seals Fund, just like you have Christmas seals for the Lung Association. So the Easter seals, you would sell these little stamps that you'd put on envelopes. They weren't postage stamps, but they would show that you were trying to find a cure for polio. And this is the iron lung. We used to have one at DCH when I got here. What is an iron lung, and how did it happen? It patented in 1927 when they realized that people couldn't breathe on their own. It's a couple of vacuum cleaners and a motor, and that forces the compression. It's got a cookie tray, they call it, where you slide them in and you slide the patient out. But the patient is pretty much dependent for everything. Notice how they put the reading material up there, and they have a mirror, and the nurse is talking to him. can't use his arms. And imagine an entire ward of iron lungs, where you had to be suctioned. A nurse had to be on guard for respiratory arrest, suctioning, oxygen, simple mobility issues. It was a full-time ICU type job. And how many of these were in use? By the way, the cost of an iron lung was $1,500, which was the cost of a house at that time. And there were 1,200 still in use in 1959, and there were 39 still in use in 2004. But as far as the eye could see in some hospitals, iron lungs. And that one is an example of, you know, all you could do all day is sit and read through that thing.
To my skirt. During the Mother's March, I get a story call from the newspaper. They could do a picture story. I felt obligated, and I felt really strange about it because they were using me to elicit sympathy so people would part with their money.
Everyone was enlisted in Basil O'Connor's crusade.
Research the way we go. If we all pitch in, we're bound to win with a high. Hi-ho, 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 hi-ho. We'll lick the polio with dimes and quarters and our dollars. Ho, hi-ho.
Hello there.
That's an actress, Joshua Gabor. You know, what was a dime, a march of dimes? That's what you would give. In school, you would give it 10 cents. And what, 10 cents could buy a hot dog, it could buy 2 Cokes. It was a phone call. You know, it wasn't an inconsiderable sum for kids to spend to help cure polio. When Jonas Salk was selected by the Easter Seal, by the Infantile Paralysis Foundation to get all of the money that they were raising, they had a competition and he won. There was another Polish vaccine developer named Koprowski who had developed the same kind of vaccine that Salk would develop and had tried it in the Congo. But Salk was doing work at the University of Pittsburgh, and his work was, and he'd done such good work in World War II that he was selected out of the competitors, and he developed the attenuated or inactivated polio vaccine. When he developed it, how many other vaccines were available? How many other vaccines did we have before we had the polio vaccine? Can you think of any? Well, we know one, we've talked about it. Smallpox. There was only one other one for yellow fever. This is just astounding. You know how many we have today? 300. So you're looking at the origins of modern virology when you see Jonas Salk. It had all 3 serotypes of killed virus, and a single dose could confer 50% immunity, 99% immunity with all 3. And there was no associated vaccine paralysis. Now, why do I mention that? Because no sooner was that, well, this is an example of Salk giving this a publicity shot of him giving the vaccine to a child. And that's what everybody saw, made the front pages of all the newspapers. That might have been me when I was 6 years old and I got my vaccine. It wasn't me, but I was a polio pioneer. I lined up, much as those kids did. And a few years ago, I went back from my reunion at my high school, which was when I got my polio shot, the elementary school. So that is my actual polio pioneer card, which I have right next to my bed, along with my COVID vaccine card. So actually, this is a real collector's item. And that's the school that I took that picture a few years ago. That's the school that I got my polio. And I remember the very day I got it when I was in kindergarten, or first grade, I guess it was. And lo and behold, the vaccine was considered a success. How did they know? Well, the numbers were that they had, let's see, it was 1.8 million kids were involved. And it was 650,000 vaccines, 750,000 placebos, and 400,000 controls. And it was a double-blind study. They did it up to grade 3. They did it at 250 test sites, mostly with at elementary schools like that. And this was such an incredible day that was really like World War II ending, and the headlines were all over the United States. Proof success, millions will be immunized soon. City schools begin shots. So this is just absolutely a godsend. And this is a rather ironic and unfortunate picture that made the rounds of the guy with polio being shown, hey, guess good news, I'm sure you're happy about it, but it's a little too late for him. Notice something about this photograph. This is actually the kind of thing that we would do. You'd line up to get it, but notice the black kids in the back there, separate lines to get vaccinated in the South. And that line was under a cigarette sign. But there was no hesitation. Every single parent wanted their kids vaccinated. They would line up for hours to get the Salk vaccine. But then something very unfortunate happened. A couple of months into this, in fact, not even 1 month into it, there was some contaminated vaccine, and over 200 cases of paralytic polio were caused by the vaccine, and 11 kids died. Now imagine if that happened with the COVID virus today. We wouldn't have the COVID virus now, I don't think. You'd say, well, why did we persist there? Well, because they identified the problem. It was quality control. They didn't sufficiently heat up the vaccine or attenuate the virus, and they fixed the problem. And were it not for President Eisenhower, who restored confidence of the American public, we probably wouldn't have been able to resume. But he got everybody confident again, and as the cases were rising again, he said, nope, we got the problem fixed, and we're going to take care of it. So if you look at back in 1916, 27,000 cases. By 49, you had 42,000. That doesn't say that there were no cases from 1916 to 49. Every year there were thousands of cases, but this is just some examples. So a peak year was 1952. That was 2 years before I was immunized. 57,000 cases, but by 1961, just 1,300. And the only factor in all that time was the Salk vaccine. And then there was something else. There were other vaccinologists like Albert Sabin, who were trying to say, well, you know, it's an okay thing, but I think mine might be better. Oh.
There's no question that the Salk vaccine, which could be developed first, has prevented thousands of cases of paralytic poliomyelitis. But the situation now is not merely a choice between one kind of automobile and another, with some slight variations, but with an entirely new kind of vaccine, which is not only simpler to take because it can be given by mouth, but because it possesses properties and capabilities for the complete elimination of the disease that the other vaccine does not.
Probably conferring lifelong immunity, more so than the Salk vaccine. Easy to administer, just take this on the sugar cube, a couple of drops. It has both cell-mediated and humoral immunity, conferring in 3 doses 95 to 99% immunity. Excellent in remaining in the GI tract where the wild virus enters in endemic areas of the world. And he had to do his research in Russia because by this point everybody was sold on Salk and nobody else was really doing much. So he went to Russia and he did his work on 10 million children. And it was found to be extremely effective. Now the problem there is because the virus is shed in stool and can be therefore around the community, that does pose a risk. But on the other hand, it helps increase herd immunity. So it's a somewhat of a controversial subject, and which has led actually to something called circulated vaccine-caused polio, and only a handful of cases. But because of them now, most places, most countries have tended to go back to the Salk vaccine, as we have in this country. And you had, this is just an example of the advertising for it. Welby says, be well, take oral polio vaccine. Now, I remember the day I went and got my sugar cube at the local high school, and here's an editorial cartoon, knock out polio. And that's a letter that I got from Albert Sabin when I wrote to him as the editor of the Medical Journal Australia and asked him if he would do an editorial, and he did. And he had done earlier work on measles and rubella, and he was a consummate virologist and also had an interest in just about everything else. He himself got Guillain-Barré syndrome, as he wrote me in that letter. Actually, we have several letters, and this is when he was 76 years old and still saying, I have so many projects that I'm still working on. I am a distant cousin, as it turns out, of Dr. Sabin, and it was really exciting to have, I still have these letters. Jonas Salk also did his summers in Rockaway Beach, New York, where I live. So there's a kind of connection there that I have to both. So again, we've talked about the herd immunity, needing 80% to be vaccinated. And the last case of wild polio in the United States is 1979. We were declared polio-free in 94. In one day in India in 2000, a series of vaccination days, and the record breaker was 121 children in a single day. That paid off. In Europe, they were declared polio-free in 2002. The goal at that time, in the beginning of the 1980s, was global eradication by 2008. Here we are in 2022, and that's not happened. The record for iron lung years is 51, and that's that same woman that was in that movie. But we weren't counting on this happening, and that was that 15 to 30 years after having polio, people would develop symptoms that were reminiscent of polio. Fatigue, weakness of the limbs, difficulty breathing. And this was codified by Dr. Valbona, the gentleman I mentioned, and others as post-polio syndrome. We have about 6 patients in our patient population that have the diagnosis of polio, by the way, probably referring to post-polio syndrome. So imagine getting hit with this horrible condition and then 15 to 30 years later getting a double whammy. And that's what these unfortunate individuals, such as the patient that I showed early, he had post-polio syndrome. I've seen him worsen a little bit over the years, fatigue. He's lost a lot of weight, and you can see it taking its toll. He is a world traveler, by the way. He hasn't let it get him down, but man, he struggled. So we have upwards of 1.6 million survivors of polio who, 15 to 40 years later, upwards of a fifth of them are going to have post-polio syndrome. And you saw that pseudohypertrophy in his leg, and you saw the fatigue and weakness. You've heard about the fatigue and weakness. So let's not forget that we still have people walking around in the world like this. The good news is that although this is an earlier headline, India was declared polio-free, and there were 350,000 cases in 1988 in the world, in 125 countries. Half of those cases were in India. So India has really had the greatest progress of any country. It is polio-free for about now close to 20 years. And the Rotary and the World Health Organization, Rotary International, combined forces to work to eradicate polio beginning in the late 1980s. They enlisted Bishop Desmond Tutu as their spokesperson. And if you look and see where on a global map polio was still being reported, it's more than half of the world. By 1994, that had shrunk a little bit, so the Americas were polio-free. By 2000, a lot more, so that Africa and just a part of Asia, Pakistan and India and Afghanistan mainly, were having polio. And 2003, just Egypt and Nigeria and another couple of countries in Africa, then just Nigeria, and no longer Egypt. You have Afghanistan and Pakistan and Nigeria by then. The good news about Nigeria is that in 2016, the last known reported case of polio occurred. By 2020, it was declared polio-free. So there you are. There's an 88 map, and there's the 2014 map. It's pretty good progress. The Western Pacific has the highest immunization rates. We're fairly average, but still pretty good. And this was the situation in 2004. How about last year? There were only about maybe half a dozen cases in the world, but the problem is that can bloom at any moment. And where are the cases? Syria, Afghanistan, and Pakistan are the main hotbeds now. And Boko Haram in Nigeria might mean that might come back too, because they're kidnapping girls, they're preventing vaccinations, and doing all sorts of horrible things. The Taliban in Pakistan and Afghanistan are real obstacles, or have been. So there's India scoring its major victory. They really took accountability. They did something no other country had ever done. And this is Nigeria. Unfortunately, this remains the problem in Pakistan. They've killed polio workers with the rumor that they were CIA operatives. And they had to actually stop the vaccinations. So there you are. The worst case scenario is going on today. And it has the lowest global vaccination rate, and you've had vaccinators getting murdered. So let's just bring it over here. This is a fairly recent headline in one of the throwaways that we get in our mailboxes. What are the biggest threats to public health in the United States? Antibiotic resistance, opioid abuse, and the anti-vax movement. Have polio-free countries lost sight of the need to keep vaccination rates high? This is JAMA's question just a few years ago. And now we're looking back at what happened in New York City, in New York State, where the low vaccination rates put certain areas in peril, which means all of us are. Now, in 2005, 5 cases of polio in an Amish population in Minnesota occurred. That scared a lot of people. But it was very self-contained. They knew what the problem was. They didn't get vaccinated. And the Amish were very amenable to getting the vaccine once they were educated about it. There was no problem there, and that was quickly ameliorated. But it served to remind us that it is always, whenever it emerges, a public health emergency, because that's how quickly it can spread. The economics of eradicating polio is very controversial, because look at the cost per case. It's just enormous now. If you were to invest all this, the cost reported for polio cases has gone up to millions of dollars a case. The argument in favor of that is that once you eradicate it, it doesn't cost you anything. You've got rid of it, and that's true of smallpox. So this polio eradication effort has already had enormous benefits by averting millions of cases, especially child deaths, saving hospital costs and health costs, creating international partnerships. The very nature of research and philanthropy was started with the Infantile Paralysis Foundation. Targeting vaccines came of this. And the government got in on the act by making the NIH a source of research. The NIH was not a major source of research funding until the polio vaccine was developed. The field of rehabilitation medicine by Dr. Howard Rusk and others developed out of polio. He started his efforts in World War II when he was assigned to a military unit with disabled individuals, and he got them back to duty in some ways with some great work, and he also was instrumental in helping to come up with rehabilitative techniques for polio patients. The disability rights movement began with polio survivors, and the independent living centers, where they didn't have to be carted off to state-owned institutions or nursing homes, but could live on their own, and the concept of universal design and accessibility all emerged out of polio. And then we had this thing a couple of years ago emerge of this flaccid paralysis in kids in Denver and elsewhere, and we still aren't quite sure. It's believed they've identified the virus. I saw it the other day, H something, so it's an enterovirus, but it's not polio, but it's a similar paralysis to polio. Have anybody heard much about this? But when I spoke at the Texas Institute of Rehabilitation and Research a few years ago, that's what was on everybody's mind, and that's all they wanted to know about, was this new emerging paralysis. But if you look overall at the history of medicine in the last century, the 2 things that have saved more lives are vaccination and stopping smoking. It's estimated that 750,000 lives alone in the United States have been saved by vaccines. Rubella was eliminated. At least that's what they said. And so was measles. 2.3 million lives saved around the world from the measles immunization programs. Isn't that incredible? And you may never see a case, but I'll bet you 50 to 1 you will. Anybody seen measles? I have, and I hope I never see another case. I hope I don't miss a case, obviously, but the most contagious virus. And you won't miss the coryza and this weepy eye and this terrible look and blotchy rash. You probably won't miss mumps either. A hockey team visiting some kids in a hospital wound up getting mumps and spreading it all over. This is rubella. I've seen rubella babies. I haven't seen an acute rubella. But they're getting a second life. They are coming back because people who don't believe in vaccines are getting, their families are getting this. So measles has reappeared in the United States where it had seemed defeated. This was in 2019, an outbreak one patient infected 695 others, 700 people under quarantine. You might think this is sort of irrelevant, but imagine if you go on a flight and you land and you are told, by the way, that a passenger on your flight had measles. There's going to be you're going to be isolated. You might be having to be quarantined. So we don't know yet what's going to happen if these measles cases continue to climb. And in the religious communities, this is from the Orthodox Jewish community, they did not like the idea of monkey, rat, and pig DNA being used in vaccines, however erroneous that belief is. And the Amish also were hit hard because they don't believe in vaccinations. A church in Texas was the center of a measles outbreak. And religious leaders in every denomination said, no, please get vaccinated. Very few religious leaders have opposed vaccination. And if you look at all the states, there are only 3 states that do not give very easy waivers from vaccine, that have very few exemptions. Which 3 states are the most progressive, well, I call progressive states, for vaccine refusal, that they won't allow a kid in school unless they have vaccines? Number 1, Mississippi. Best vaccination program in the United States. Number 2, West Virginia. Hard to believe, West Virginia. Number 3, California. So before the vaccine against measles came out in the 1980s, we had 4 million cases a year. We had, I don't know how many deaths, but there were several thousand deaths a year from measles. In 2000, we only had 37 cases, so it was declared eliminated, but in 2014, a single case in Disneyland led to 644 cases, and by 2015, there were outbreaks that affected 17 states in the District of Columbia. So now we have 50,000 cases in 2014, and through global travel, this has not gone away. It can occur in the vaccinated because there's not enough herd immunity, and people aren't getting vaccinated. I found this article in my file that I had said when I was a resident on vaccination refusal. This was in 1976 in the New York Times. And so it wasn't a problem just recently. It was going on in the late 70s. But now it's certainly on the rise. And it's all attributable to this one article in The Lancet by a guy named Wakefield, who claimed that measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine caused Crohn's disease, developmental delay, autism, and it was called ileal lymphoid nodular hyperplasia, nonspecific colitis, and pervasive developmental disorder in children. He had 8 cases. But it was only found out later how this guy operated. It was a fraud. He was getting money from lawyers, plaintiffs' lawyers, to sue vaccine companies. He was trying to patent his own pseudo-vaccine. He was barred from practicing in the United Kingdom. He was disgraced, and his studies was called a fraud. That didn't stop him from leaving the United Kingdom and coming to Texas, where he lives today, and he leads the effort to oppose vaccination today. So here he was being interviewed, and it took The Lancet fully 12 years to retract that paper, having done enormous damage. And there he is, not long ago at an autism family rally opposing vaccination. And this is the kind of advertising that is being paid for by anti-vaccination individuals. A 6,000% increase in autism, blaming it on vaccines. Well, 15 years after that autism theory began, the measles plague erupts. So they claimed that it was the mercury. So they took the mercury out, the same thing, nothing happened, nothing changed in terms of the case. So then they said, well, it's the number of vaccines that you're giving people. Now look at all those vaccines today versus 1983. Well, yeah, but that's how vaccines are given. They don't just one little thing. It's not. They're a science that involves giving several doses to build up your immunity. Are we over-vaccinating our kids? But the Institute of Medicine said there is no link between autism and the vaccine. And yet, parents today, most parents, are still wary of vaccines. They don't deny the vaccines work. They won't want to risk the side effects. They refuse to accept the actual scientific evidence. They want their kids to attend school, and they don't want to be discriminated against. They claim that vaccines cause autism, that too many vaccines overwhelm the kids' immune systems, and that vaccines cause diabetes. They say, well, we don't need vaccines anymore because we're a modern society and everybody's got herd immunity. They think the scientific community doesn't know what it's talking about. And they said, then when they took out the mercury, they said, well, it's aluminum that does it. And it could all be summed in this cartoon. You represent a parent's right to choose, resist government mandates, and live free. How does that make you feel, son? Sick. Unfortunately, doctors are having to fire vaccine refusers. And there are stars like Robert Kennedy, Robert Kennedy's son, who's been a real anti-vaccination hero to many people. And the insurrection mob there had many anti-vaccine people, including a couple of physicians who have been convicted and are serving the jail time right now. How did the anti-vaccine movement get involved in the Capitol riot? Facebook has had to curb anti-vaccine posts, and less than half of Alabamians are getting the flu shot. Flu can kill, as we've seen. And when COVID came out, 18 Alabama deaths made the front page. It was big, big, big news. We don't ever want to take this for granted. This was when it was 100,000 deaths, and they printed the names of all those individuals in the New York Times. And African Americans bear the brunt as the deaths climb. And this led a certain network to start saying, as we gave greater attention to African Americans and their risk factors, oh, they're practicing racial medicine. And then here's when it was 500,000. The New York Times put a dot for every individual, filled up the whole page. And this is what we have on not just this network, but all over the internet. This is just the most visible example of an anti-vaccine or vaccine denier. He got vaccinated, and so did his boss that owns the network. But it's you get more views if you become controversial and you cast doubt. So they started calling it the China virus, sort of racially insensitive too. And mocking one of the most brilliant public health officials who's in Seattle, saying that he just wants control. This isn't public health. And you're not allowed to ask questions. Of course you're allowed to ask questions about the vaccine. We don't know 100% of what's going on. We're going with the best available science. And yesterday a report was released about the CDC and how 19 HHS officials helped censor and tamp down the COVID reaction that the CDC was working on, developing guidelines and so forth. They were censored. They were prevented from reporting their results because it didn't make the administration look good. And so that report was issued by a House committee yesterday. No questions allowed. This is just not true. Well, of course there are reactions, but as far as we know, the vaccine hasn't killed anyone. There'll be no question. Of course, this is just total and complete nonsense. And herd immunity. This claim was made at the very earliest stages of this pandemic, that herd immunity was the solution. Well, maybe that will be true eventually, but when people were dying left and right, and some of you were on the front lines and seeing this every day, and the fact that we're still masking in most instances, that's going to be a long ways off. And they're calling those of us who favor vaccination extremists. I think it's abhorrent, and I think it's disgraceful. So here we've reached 1 million deaths with COVID. We hope that polio won't come back and cause anywhere near the problems it did. But it is that contagious, and we are failing right now. So I didn't want to end on a totally negative note, but unfortunately, we don't give our efforts an A. We might be able to get a gentleman's C out of this right now, but it's up to you, no matter what your personal beliefs are, to get the discussions going and to try to encourage people to act on the basis of science and not mythology. So with that in mind, I want to thank you for letting me go a little bit over. How about 1 or 2 comments, or spitballs, or critiques, or comments, or anything you want? How about an opposing opinion? How about a concurring opinion? John, where's the wisdom, Dr. Bell? Say anything you like.
Well, if I had to say something, again, my opinion on the COVID vaccine is that it's a little bit different than all the vaccines that you talked about throughout the lecture, just because it's very new. And I think putting aside all the really bad, like Dr. Wakefield's contribution to the field, if you put that aside, I think doctors have kind of done a lot in the last several decades to kind of lose the public's trust So I kind of understand where a lot of my patients are coming from when they push back on that. I'm not disagreeing that it's important, but I think it's something that requires like a relationship of trust.
So how just one example, would you say Dr. Fauci lost trust? Spending his 60-year career in that field of virology, helping develop the AIDS treatments and others, would he be one that you'd say lost trust? Or would there be examples of physicians who lost trust?
I think what I was referring more to is like medications that get withdrawn from the market after a year, after it gets prescribed like candy or things like that. So it's just small behaviors like that people have kind of, as information become more widespread, people are more trying to make their own decisions and not just take it from the doctor's mouth.
Just one word in defense of the COVID vaccine. You know that this vaccine was developed very rapidly. The fastest vaccine ever. Both companies, the major Moderna and Pfizer, did this development in record time. You'd say, well, doesn't that make your point that it was so rapidly developed that they didn't have time to do an extensive trial? They only did 1 year's of trial. How could that be that you could say this is perfectly safe and wonderful vaccine? Well, because they knew what to develop based on the SARS epidemic that was stifled back 20 years ago. The individual, she knew that at Moderna, she recognized this genome, and as soon as the Chinese revealed the genome, she had the vaccine developed within 1 week. The rest of that year was trials. I myself said, there's no way. The mumps vaccine took 4 years, and that was partly developed in Houston, where I was at Baylor. I was in awe of the people developing the mumps, and thinking what they went through for 4 or 5 years. To develop a vaccine in a year is crazy. I totally agree with that. But wow, did they know what they were doing? And all I can say, I think this is one of the greatest miracles I have ever seen, the COVID vaccine. And again, I did suggest to DCH that when they started listing the census, to please indicate who was vaccinated and who was not. And they started doing that, and I think the numbers speak for themselves. It's not a foolproof vaccine. No vaccine is. There were always breakthroughs. But look at the relative risk of those who were vaccinated and those who are unvaccinated. Now, I personally believe that masking alone probably would have done a lot, and I would agree that there was some doubt in the early stages of this about wearing masks. But I think overall, the one thing I would stand up for is the COVID vaccine. Last comments? Good for the order?
I don't think that Dr. McHale was saying that he didn't believe in vaccines. I mean, I personally heard him, advocate for vaccines. I think his generalized point was that doctors, and not just saying in the CDC, but doctors in general, I mean, we're all human beings. We've made mistakes. There's been a lot of pay to play. We don't demand the same respect that we used to in our communities, that we used to. We used to be that what the doctor said goes, and now there's a lot of doubt that's been sown. I mean, and that's just across the board when we talk to our patients. I mean, especially African American patients. There's been a lot of reasons why they don't trust the medical community for various legitimate reasons. And so I think that's kind of more what he was.
I agree, and I think your summary is excellent. Yeah, I think family physicians really have that ability to turn that around. And no, I agree with everything you just said. I think he started by saying the COVID vaccine as an example that, because it came out so quickly and it did earn a lot of skepticism. I was an early skeptic, even though I quickly got it first, but I was still amazed that they could develop it that quickly. But I think your larger point of trust and communication is the major point. Thanks for making that.
And like that's kind of what I meant. Because like I have a lot of patients, even when I'm prescribing them like a blood pressure medication, the first thing they'll ask me is this something new? Because if you look at something like the MMR vaccine, it's like, well, that's been tested up and down the wazoo at this point. But they're a little bit more skeptical because the whole pay to play thing, and if they don't know the doctor that well,
right.
Do they really have my best interest in mind?
Totally agree. My philosophy was just be not the first to use nor the last to discard. There's a bell-shaped curve of how the pharmaceutical companies know there's a bell-shaped curve of how we administer medications. There's the two standard deviations to the left are the people that actually do the research and who write the articles for New England Journal. Then there are people who read the journals and who read carefully that, and they say, okay, it's good or it's bad, I'm going to do that. That's like another 20%. And then there's the rest of most of the curve where, okay, they're doing it, they're the big attendings, I might as well do it too. But then they get into the first standard deviation, which is you don't ever want to go to them for any reason. And the two standard deviations are the Wakefields and the people that want hydroxychloroquine for COVID and so forth. So I think the vast majority of physicians are, we're well toward that early part of the curve. And I appreciate you making the point. Thanks.
Just wanted to remind everybody that we've got pumpkin carving outside on the sidewalk. If you don't want to stay for that, feel free to leave. Stay for IT.
She seconded it.